I'm Kelsey Litchfield, and this is the Field Advisor Podcast, where I talk with local experts to unpack the latest agronomy information and research, giving you the knowledge to make informed decisions out in the field. Welcome back to Field Advisor. I'm Kelsey Litchfield. Joining me is someone you should all know if you don't know, Stephanie Porter, Illinois Soybean Association agronomist and certified crop advisor. Stephanie often says, I've had a lot of jobs, so you've probably seen me somewhere, somehow. So thanks for joining me today, Stephanie. Okay, I promised you this would be a kind of a lightning episode. I had 11 questions. Now I'm up to 13, maybe 13 and a half. But this is all about planting season. Here we are recording April 2nd. It's time to get it in gear here pretty soon and go. Some are already going, correct? You saw some planters down in Southern Illinois.
Or we call it South Central or Central, yes.
That's about to get dumped on with rain if the weatherman is correct. So I guess we'll see how that plays out. Okay, so first question, obviously being early April, I did say that. Farmers are starting to look to plant soybeans in the ground. It's becoming more of a common practice now to put beans in before corn, although some will probably still argue the other way around. So planting soybeans early has been shown to boost yields, but I want farmers to understand just can't go throw the beans out there, cross your fingers, and hope for good luck. What are some of the risks that they need to be aware of?
Yeah, and I think most farmers are pretty aware of most of the risks, obviously, but I think we get to a point where we think that sometimes we hear people say that soybeans are bulletproof, and that's not necessarily true. They still can suffer some frost damage. We saw that up close and personal a year or so ago. That's still possible, and the soybean can still experience something we call ambitional chilling injury underground. So that's when it would absorb some cold water. There's always the opportunity for that, unfortunately. But for the most part, we want to make sure that those growing points, if they're above ground, and if they happen to get some frost, they still could be alive. We just got to make sure they're still alive after that. And so I would say those are the main issues with early planting. The other things are early season diseases and reduced plant populations, which is due to Mother Nature just going in earlier with not just the cold, but you just called it the wet. That's a major issue. Sometimes crusting of the soil surface. That's depending on in areas with tillage and depending on their soil types and drainage and that kind of thing. And then lastly, I would say just planters in general.
Speaking of tillage, what about the no-tillers out there, such as my family? I mean, we're not planting beans in April, or should we?
You could. I think a lot of people think that you can't. I think what it boils down to is when is the soil fit? That's where when I like to talk about planting, when you can plant soybeans the same time as corn. If you think you can plant corn, you can plant soybeans. That's what I always say. So you run into issues with no-till situations because not only can the soil still be cooler, it can also still be wetter. And so that's when the soils aren't necessarily fit. They take longer to dry out. Sometimes in no-till situations, you may want to bump up the populations, but really the key, and we already said it, is the planter setup is instrumental in a no-till situation. Things like row cleaners, setup, and the way they're adjusted, and other things that you may add to the planter to make sure that that residue is not piled up, it's evenly distributed, and we get it out of the way. We need a row cleaner to get it out of the way of the row so we can have that plant emerge. And I guess another thing that we might run into issues with no-till would be seeding depth as well. And sometimes, to get to good conditions in a no-till situation, you might increase the seeding depth in some instances.
When you say that the soil is fit, does that mean it has a six-pack? I'm just joking. I told you I wanted to have fun with this.
She loves all my farmer talk, my slang. It means in the olden days, I like to say we used to worry a lot about the soil temperature. Where I think in the last 10 years we've kind of, depending on where you're at in Central Illinois and Southern Illinois, that's totally out the window. I don't think we focus as much on that. I think we focus mainly if the soil's fit, if it's not too wet out there. That's when you can start causing issues and having issues with crop emergence and seeding depth and just horrible issues that I don't want to have to go to your field and see.
Yeah. Being north of Stephanie, she made fun of me when I got out the soil temperature probe last year. She goes, "We don't use those."
It's true.
It's true. It's okay. Okay, so speaking of no-till, you kind of already said this. I just want to make sure that we've covered this. I know I saw Andrew Margonaut, Illinois Soybean Association, is funding his study that's looking at challenges when planting soybeans into heavy corn residue. You talked about the row cleaners. Anything else to keep in mind when planting into that heavy residue?
Some might say there could be some pest challenges that go along with it. One that stands out in my mind just because it was last year is slugs and issues like that. I think they just go hand in hand with just more the environmental conditions or the environment that the no-till field might hold. It's more conducive for them there to live there and multiply and grow there too. So just keep that in mind.
Talking about seeding populations, you just wrote a blog called Soybean Seeding Rates, How Low Can You Go? I believe was the title. I've looked at it and I'm just blanked on what it was called, but it was talking about soybean seeding rate. Talk about that for early planted soybeans first, and then what adjustments should be made as we move into later April, May, and what those populations look like.
So I think what we've learned thus far, and there's so much more to learn, but I'll say that. But with early planting, we've learned we need the help most of the time with a seed treatment. We may not necessarily boost the yield, but we definitely help protect that seed when we're planting early. So that's one thing that we use to help mitigate some of the risks that we can have with more disease if we're going early. Some things we have to take into consideration is that there's a lot of people now reducing plant populations, and we have to be a little bit more careful going into an early planting situation. And use example, right? I know some people that have already planted some soybeans now, and we have this big heavy rain coming in. We had the same situation last year on our own farm, and we ended up in a situation where we did have to go in and replant certain spots. And so I think that's one thing that stays in my mind if I get called. I think there's a lot of other things that go into it that others may not think about, like no-till, like you just said, in an early planting situation. Soil type is another one. It's big. You may want to increase your seeding rate, no matter if you're early planting or not. And so those are just some considerations that I take into, I guess, think about with early planting, and just trying to not only just, there's just so many risks, like you said, we talked about, that you want to try to overcome. And I don't want to have to replant if I don't have to. It's not fun.
How did you determine whether to replant or just let it go?
We did have to replant, and the worst part of it is that most of the time when you have a replant situation, it's just your low counts are in areas of the field, your problem areas of the field. For example, your wet spots. And so then you have to, you don't tear up the whole field. You go in and you try to adjust the plant population so you can replant in those wet spots. And then there lies, what's your population when you go back in? You don't want to get it too thick, and it can become a very hairy situation.
Mm-hmm. Any recommendations when it comes to variable rate in seeding, like different places that you've touched on it, but anything there that to keep farmers aware of when going out and adjusting that?
So I think There's different definitions of variable rate. I think that people can just do it themselves. They adjust the planter depending on different field conditions and such. There's actually, research going on where the planter does that for you. Not everybody has that. So it's nothing new. I know it's probably, I think, been tested a little bit more with uh, corn than soybeans, and not to say it can't be done with soybeans, because it definitely can. In my, I guess when I took a look at it before, it was much more conducive for areas to do variable seeding rate when you had different soil types or different issues within the field. That's where it became more economical. So that's where you would want to do something like changing seeding rates. But there's other people, for example, in central Illinois, when you have all flat black, it's just not something that you may invest in because you may not get your money's worth to invest in certain equipment, for example. But definitely different soil types. You can develop different zones. I think that variable rates will depend upon soybean varieties, which I don't know is, I know some crop consultants that are looking into that. Definitely same as corn. So some you may plant differently at different populations. There's some that's doing different rates for disease history. For example, you might want to go a lower rate in areas where you have white mold, and go a higher rate in another problem area in the field, maybe a fertility issue or so on. And I think when I think of variable rate seeding, one of the biggest things I think some people are doing in Southern Illinois is going either lower or higher around their field just because of the deer issue.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was about to say. On the edges.
Yeah, it's a major issue.
Why wouldn't they just want to increase, knowing that their population would be eventually decreased? If you get what my question is.
I think some of them are trying that.
Okay.
I just think there's a lot of different things going on, and I think definitely more research needed in that area. If you're interested, anybody.
Anybody out there. And it costs more money, which leads to my next question. No surprise where soybean markets are right now. They're still in the $10 range. I couldn't give you exact. I haven't looked today. But is there still talk on cost cutting this spring, and where are farmers doing that in the soybean side?
I think there is still a little bit of talk. I think people are just ready to plant now. I think they're just ready to go. But there's always opportunity to cut back.
Maybe on fungicides
and on herbicides too.
Which would you say not to cut on, fungicides or herbicides? Tough question, I know.
Sorry. If I had to answer it right now before the crop's even in the ground, I would say do not cut back on your herbicide. Since you made me answer that question.
I know. As soon as it came out, I'm like, she doesn't probably want to answer that. But I will say, I won't hold you to it. People listening shouldn't hold you to it until we get to the end of June, and that answer, we'll see. But on the topic of herbicides, we've seen there is maybe potential issues using pre-herbicides, and talking about early planted soybeans. Kind of talk about what you've been seeing. ISA funded a research with Dr. Hager. What's coming out of that when it comes to pre-emergence herbicides and early planted soybeans?
Yeah, so I think definitely with the early planted soybean situation, more people doing that, we're running into issues with either reduced plant populations due to seed treatments like Alivo, as well as the Alivo plus the pre-emergence herbicides, or just both, pre-emergence herbicides. This is because of the cold, wet planting conditions, or even some soil types where you run into these issues more. It's becoming more prevalent, and actually our board members have run into this. I know this for sure because I've been in some fields. There has been some recent research done by the Crop Protection Network that they found no negative effect on plant stands and soybean yields from phytotoxicity with the Alivo and or with pre-emergence herbicides. And often I would attribute that to the plasticity of the soybeans and their, ability to make up for lower populations. So just because you have a low population to a certain extent does not mean that you'll necessarily lose yield all the time. And like you said, Dr. Hager is doing some ISA funded research currently, looking at the soybean's ability or lack of ability to metabolize herbicides in cold, wet conditions. And so those are things that we'll definitely keep reporting back on Field Advisor.
Anything else when it comes to weed control that you're seeing right now? I don't see in my area, at least, which I haven't gotten out lately, so this could be wrong. But spring burn down. What's going on there? I haven't seen as much. What was it? Henbit was the problem last year. Maybe I'm starting to see it a little bit. Maybe it's still too early. I don't know. What's
Yeah,
going
yeah.
on there?
Well, I mean, I said, to your defense, compared to if we compare it to last year, it's not as bad, just because of the maybe colder winter. There's always a factor of whether or not people used some fall burn down. That helps as well. But we are warming up, and you're welcome to come down here to see our henbit. It's really looking pretty right now. So it's here. So we are in a situation where I think farmers are just waiting. I've seen burn down applications going on. You want to wait till obviously the weeds are actively growing, which I think they are. We're mowing around here, so we're ready. We just can't be too wet after this big storm. That's going to be the other issue. And I think the third most important thing is the wind situation.
Oh, yeah.
That has been horrendous, and that's also hindering a lot of these burn down applications that have been taking place.
Agreed. As we are recording this, the wind is howling outside. And we'll see on the rain temperature wise too. I was talking to someone last week when it came to the cover crops. They said, "Yep, the cover crops are bright and they're green, but they're not growing. They just haven't had it. It's been colder, so they haven't been growing as much." So
Right.
that's something to notice as we're heading into spring planting. So, speaking of, we were kind of talking of last fall. You had something interesting in your blog about seed quality concerns and how dry last fall was. Anything to share there, especially when it comes to seeding rates?
Yeah, so we just had our seed delivered. And so my brother and I were having a conversation about seeding rate and obviously, making sure the planter's ready and such. I reminded him because I just wrote the blog. I said, go check on your seed tag or on obviously the seed box that it came in. There you can check whether or not the quality, the seed quality or the germination, because last year the very dry, lower than 8% harvest could cause issues with seed quality. That doesn't necessarily mean it did on everything, but just make sure you check that. If the seed germination is 92% or better, that's fine. If not, if it's below 85%, that's when we start to get a little worried, and you might want to increase your seeding rates to adjust for that. So, and I guess the other thing to remember, and this, I don't want to speak for all seed companies, but a lot of times when they do that seed germination test in order to put it on the seed bag or the box, it's a warm seed germination test. Not always. I know that's a question. Some farmers actually do their own cold germination tests. They can send it off to the lab. But just make sure that if that was a warm germination test, then it's not necessarily simulating a cold, wet spring or early plant situation. So there again, you might have to adjust your seeding rate for that. Plant 10 to 15% more, for that lower germination rate, especially if you're planting early.
Yeah, something to look at once you get that seed delivery, which I have been seeing those go by. Okay, wrapping up here, because I promised this would be short, but it's a lot of good information. I mean, we're covering a lot of different topics here. And I saved disease kind of for last because I know that's one of the things you love to talk about. Well, maybe not love, but enjoy talking about. Let's talk seedling diseases, what to be aware of, what conditions entice those diseases to pop up.
So I would say, we think of early planting, we think cool and wet, and there's a lot of diseases that that's the right environment or the right disease triangle for those types of diseases. So those examples of those would be Phytophthora, SDS, Pythium. There's also Fusariums. Some of these, there's also Pythium. But there's also some of these diseases, for example, like a rhizoctonia, that sometimes, depending on the species, can want hot and dry conditions. So that's first and foremost. Second, I guess, would be there's some diseases, for example, Phytophthora and SDS, that we don't have to just count on or need some fungicides for or seed treatments for. We want to make sure and specifically look at varieties that have resistance or RPS genes effective against certain Phytophthora races. And we also have certain varieties that may have a higher score, meaning more resistance or tolerance to SDS. So those are other things to take into consideration when we're thinking about seedling diseases, especially when we early plant.
Yeah. I was just listening to a podcast earlier that says it's Illinois. You could have summer in the afternoon, 5 inches of snow overnight, and windy as all get out the next day. Illinois weather's constantly changing, thus the growing seasons are so different. So what might have been a problem last year might not be a problem this year, and vice versa. So my last question for you is the importance of crop scouting and getting out into your fields, making observations throughout the growing season.
I think it's becoming more and more important because a lot of farmers are becoming a little bit more conscientious of costs. We have obviously higher costs, lower commodity prices. And I've always been an advocate to just make sure you know what's going on, because once you know what's going on, then you can start solving the problem. We may not have all the answers. But for example, if you don't know if it's a disease versus a planting / pest issue, you're not going to be able to get to the bottom of it. So I think it is very important to scout, depending at least the beginning, middle, end of the year. But I think there are some people going in at least every couple weeks or so, looking not only at diseases, pests, but weeds is another huge issue to watch for. Make sure we get our post on in an adequate manner, as well as just all the other oopsies that can go wrong.
Mm-hmm. And that's a plug for the crop report. The Field Advisor crop report will have people scouting all over the state and sending in their observations via the crop report. So I will mention that. And I'll put in a plug, Stephanie, for the agronomists on the ISA agronomy team who are independent. They have no products to sell. They just want to help people. If you have a question about a field, you can get a hold of us you can go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just search Field Advisor, and we can get you connected to the right people. Stephanie, anything else that you can think of that we didn't cover?
I can't think of anything. I mean, anything you want to throw at me. I can't think of anything else.
Nothing to throw at you right now. I think we're just in a wait and see pattern, so I'm sure I'll be calling you up. I do want to say that Stephanie will be in our upcoming webinar for Field Advisor. Ask the ISA agronomy team. I conned her into it on Thursday, April 24th. So Stephanie, Stacy Zuber, who's the soil scientist, and Abigail Peterson, who is the director of agronomy at Illinois Soybean Association, they're going to be talking about the growing season, crop scouting, what farmers should be aware of, and a whole lot more. And that's Thursday, April 24th virtually. So you can go to fieldadvisor.org and get registered. And on the registration page is where you can ask your questions, or you can just register and ask your questions live and maybe try to stump Stephanie.
That'd be fun. No pressure.
Have you been stumped before?
I'm sure I have.
But you always figure it out.
I do. I like to phone a friend. I do that a lot too.
Stephanie also likes Scooby-Doo mysteries.
I do.
So stay tuned for a blog, because I'm sure there's going to be 1 or 2 this year. Stephanie, thanks for joining me on the Field Advisor podcast.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor podcast. Unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor podcast on your favorite podcast platform.